Hello guys, it's teacher Yolanda here. Welcome to our session 27. For this session we're going to need our content areas, our reading projects and the reading project exercises. And today we're not watching something related to science. Today we're jumping into social studies. The title of the book we're going to read today is Martin Luther King Jr. It's almost at the end of the book, or at the end of the book actually. Here we can see Martin Luther King Jr. at the Lincoln Memorial in 1963. A girl marches in a Martin Luther King Day parade. Introduction. 1/3 Monday in January, Americans celebrate Martin Luther King Day. We honor a great African American leader who worked for freedom for all people. Who was this man? Who has a national holiday in his name? Growing up in the South, Martin Luther King Jr. was born in Atlanta, Georgia, on January the 15th, 1929. His father was a Baptist minister, and his mother was a teacher. Martin grew up in a busy and loving family. He and his sister and brother studied, took music lessons, and played sports. This is the childhood home of Martin Luther King Jr. In the South, African Americans had always lived under laws that were unfair to them. Before the Civil War, most blacks had been slaves to white owners. During this war, President Abraham Lincoln granted freedom to slaves by passing a special law. But even though black people were freed from slavery, Southern lawmakers passed new laws to keep them separated or segregated from white people. This is President Abraham Lincoln. Black men drink from fountains labeled "for colored only." These laws, called Jim Crow laws, deprive blacks of many rights. Black children went to separate, poorer schools than white children. On buses, blacks had to sit in the back seats and give up those seats if whites wanted them. Blacks were forced to use public drinking fountains and restrooms marked "for colored only." In earlier days, African Americans were called colored. White people used drinking fountains and restrooms that were marked "for whites only." And of course, these restrooms and fountains were better and cleaner. A poor family and their Washington District of Columbia apartment. As Martin grew up, he learned from his parents and his teachers that the laws calling for segregation were unfair. African Americans were suffering from not having equal rights. Many of them were poor and could not find jobs. Martin wanted to help African American people gain full freedom and civil rights. Martin was a bright student. At age 15, he went to college near his home in Atlanta. He then went north to continue his religious education. He decided when he was 19 that he would be a Baptist minister like his father. He had read about Mohandas Gandhi, the great leader from India. Gandhi believed in using love, not hate, to stop injustice. Martin decided that he, too, wanted to use peaceful, non-violent ways to help people. In the picture we have Mohandas Gandhi. While he was up north, Martin met his future wife, Coretta Scott. She was studying to become a singer. On their first date, Martin told Coretta he wanted to marry her. He liked her for her beliefs and her commitment to equality, as well as her beauty. In the summer of 1953, they got married. A year later, Martin took his first preaching job at a Baptist church in Montgomery, Alabama. This photo of Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. and his wife Coretta was taken 3 years after they married. children at an integrated school in Washington, District of Columbia, in 1954. Look at it, we have white kids and black kids. That was the meaning of integrated. Starting his work. In 1954, the United States Supreme Court ruled that schools could no longer be segregated or divided by race. The court ordered schools to integrate so that different races could attend the same school. With this important ruling, African Americans became very hopeful that they could change society. Martin and other leaders encouraged people to work together peacefully to win civil rights for everyone, no matter their race or religion. So pay attention. He was working to win civil rights for everyone. That means civil rights for white people, Latin people, black people, Asian people, Eskimo people, all the people in the world, not only black people. Members of the KKK or the Ku Klux Klan burned a cross at a meeting. But some white people were not happy with the Supreme Court ruling. They fought integrated schools. A group of white people called the Ku Klux Klan, KKK, tried to prevent blacks from having equal rights. Members of the KKK wore white robes and hoods to hide their faces. Their actions were often violent. Many other white people, while not violent, opposed integration as well. Yet, many other whites around the country supported integration and full equality for blacks. Some worked along with blacks to gain civil rights. In December 1955, something important happened in Montgomery, where Martin and his family were living. A black woman named Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a bus to a white man. She was arrested. The black citizens of the city were outraged. What is outrage? Angry. And they decided to protest. They refused to ride city buses because they wanted an end to segregation on the buses. This kind of protest, in which people refuse to participate in something in order to force a change, is called boycott. It is a peaceful means of protest. Pay attention, this picture shows Rosa Parks is fingerprinted in Montgomery, Alabama. So she was sitting in a bus, and a man told her to stand up because it was a white's place. So Rosa said that she wanted to stay there, so she went to jail just for that. So they started a boycott. All the black people in Alabama decided that they wouldn't ride any bus anymore, so that they wouldn't win money from that. Yes? Martin became the leader of the Montgomery bus boycott. People supported the boycott by walking or carpooling. What is carpooling? Lots of people going in one car, but they would not ride the buses. The boycott went on for over a year. The city would not change the segregation law. Many angry amenazas, threats were made to Martin and his family. Once their house was bombed. No one was hurt, but Martin realized that he and his family were in danger. In November 1966, the boycott ended in victory for the African American community. Soon after that victory, the Supreme Court ruled that Alabama could no longer segregate riders on buses. This is a church-operated station wagon, provided transportation for blacks during the Montgomery bus boycott. A 1960 sit-in at whites-only lunch counter. Marches and struggles. Still, violence against African Americans continued in the South. Several churches were firebombed in Montgomery. Martin spoke out, saying, "We will not hate you, but we will not obey your evil laws." Courageous blacks started to test the unfair laws on segregation. In 1960, small groups of students began sit-ins at lunch counters where only white people could be served. During a sit-in, people sit somewhere and refuse to move as a form of peaceful protest. While the blacks sat in their seats, angry whites often pushed or beat them. But in time, the sit-ins were successful. By the end of the year, more than 100 southern towns had integrated in their lunch counters. So that means that there were places for whites and places for blacks. This Freedom Riders bus was firebombed in Alabama in 1961. Passengers escaped without serious injury. The next year, a group of black and white Americans called the Freedom Riders rode together on buses through the southern states. They wanted to test the new law banning segregation. When they got to Alabama, violent gangs of Southerners, including members of the KKK, banned the buses and attacked the riders. The local police didn't offer much protection, and many people were hurt. Finally, the federal government in Washington, District of Columbia, sent in 500 U.S. troops to put a stop to the violence. In April 1963, Martin helped organize protests and marches in Birmingham to stop segregation in the city. During one protest, the marchers were met by Police Chief Bull Connor and his men. Attack dogs were set on loose on the marchers, even on children. The marchers were sprayed with high-pressure fire hoses. Many were seriously injured. More than 3,000 African Americans were arrested and jailed. President Kennedy sent U.S. troops to Birmingham to stop the violence. Finally, the city ended its segregation laws. Television and newspaper reports of the violence in Birmingham made more and more people aware of the unfair and harsh treatment of African Americans. It brought more attention to the need for equal rights for all people. So pay attention. They were in a march, and then they were sprayed with powerful fire hoses from a fire engine, and they were set even with wild dogs attack on fire. All of this by the police. Martin Luther King Jr. gives his famous I Have a Dream speech. I have a dream. President Kennedy spoke out in support of civil rights. He said it was time for all citizens to be free. Much encouraged Martin called for a march on Washington, D.C. for August the 28th, 1963. More than 250,000 black and white Americans walked from the Washington Monument to the Lincoln Memorial. They marched for freedom, rights, and dignity for all people. The cheering crowd heard Martin give his famous I Have a Dream speech. He shared his dream that one day people of all colors will live together peacefully and be free at last from judgment or mistreatment because of their skin color. Sadly, 3 months later, President Kennedy was assassinated, but the Civil Rights Act, which he supported and which ended segregation in all public buildings, became law in 1964. Here we have President Lyndon Johnson signs into law the Civil Rights Act. The next struggle for blacks was for voting rights. In the South, some whites made it nearly impossible for many blacks to vote. In some places, they charged a special tax. Many poor people could not afford. Those who failed to pay the tax were not allowed to vote. Civil rights supporters staged a peaceful demonstration for voting rights in Mississippi in 1964. Following Alabama Governor George Wallace's orders, state troopers used tear gas on peaceful demonstrators. In Selma, Alabama, Martin led long lines of African Americans to the registration offices. He was arrested for his action and later released. Then the marchers started marching on the road from Selma to Montgomery. They wanted to present a complaint to the governor of Alabama, George C. Wallace, but he ordered the march stopped. The marches continued as were stopped by state troopers who used tear gas and clubs to stop the marches. The day is remembered as Bloody Sunday. Later, on August 6, 1965, with the support of President Johnson, the Voting Rights Act was passed in Washington, D.C. It was a great victory of all people. Sorry, for all people. So, you may be wondering what's the meaning of this thing that we have. Gloves. Gloves is macanas. Yes, those bat-like things that the police carry. Martin Luther King Jr. participates in a civil rights march in Memphis days before his assassination. One last march. In 1968, Martin planned a post-people campaign. The goal was to get better homes, schools, and jobs for poor people of all races and backgrounds. That spring, he went to help out on a strike held by the garbage collectors in Memphis, Tennessee. During a strike, workers refused to work until they win better wages, that is, payment, or working conditions. While in Memphis, Martin was killed by an assassin's bullet. He died on April 4th, 1968, at the age of 39. The whole world mourned the death of this great man. What is mourned? This one that is here, mourned. Mourned is tener un duelo. Dolerse. Martin Luther King Jr. is remembered for making real the dream of equality. He is remembered as a man of peace and a champion of rights and freedom for every people of every color. So, it is a bit sad to see that a man so powerful and so peaceful was yet assassinated. Yet, we have some exercises. In the exercises, it says, instructions: list the important events from the final section of Martin Luther King Jr. That means one last march. Then use the information to create a summary of the final section in the summary box. You have to talk about who are they talking about, what are they talking about, when, where, and why, and finally make a summary. In the book, you're also going to identify cause and effect relationships in each section. So per section, you're going to find a cause and effect of whatever Martin Luther King Jr. did. Next, it says choose a synonym and an antonym for each word from the box. Put a check mark by each word after you check your answers in the thesaurus. What is a thesaurus? A thesaurus is a dictionary that has antonyms and synonyms. You can use the internet for this activity. Go on and find the meanings and decide which is the synonym and the antonym, and we're going to check later in our class. Last but not least, there are some powerful and really important videos that we're going to watch about Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. and also some activities that we have to do in the PDF files. So make sure you do them and have them ready before our class. And I'll see you in a few minutes. Bye!